Good morning. How is everyone? Thank you for having me here today to talk about housing in Maryland and where we see this very vital issue going. My name is Lisa May. I am Director of Advocacy and Public Policy for Maryland REALTORS. We are a real estate trade association of approximately 25,000 real estate professionals based in Annapolis, Maryland. And in my role, I am one of the lead lobbyists for the organization, pushing for pro-real estate legislation in the Maryland General Assembly. And this year is really no different. This is a hot button issue all over the country, but certainly in Maryland as well. Governor Moore and his Department of Housing and Community Development has made this a key plank of his administration, now entering year 4 of that timeline. So we have had a whole lot to talk about in terms of housing and what it means for both Maryland residents and our economy. And that is why we have titled this Maryland's Future Begins at Home. So let's get into it. The things that I want to cover today are quantifying what Maryland's housing supply and housing shortage looks like, what that means for Maryland residents, their budgets, their outlook for their future here in the state, what this means for Maryland's economic competitiveness, our economy, our ranking among other states. And then finally, what 2026 is looking like in terms of legislation, both things that we have already done, but what we might need to do in the future, and things that are being debated right now as we speak in the General Assembly. So I'm going to start this off with a graph that doesn't look quite so great. So if you go to the United States Census and dig through their building permit data by year, you can see this downward trend that we're on. And a lot is being made right now about how Maryland hasn't rebounded from the real estate housing crash in the 2007, 2008, 2009 timeframe. And that is absolutely true. Since then, we have not gotten back up above 20,000 annual building permits. But if we go back, you can see that we've been on this downward trend for a very, very long time. And that generally speaking, in each decade, we're losing, 5 to 10,000 building permits each year. And this hasn't been updated since 2021. I can tell you, though, that the 2022 to 2024 are just kind of middling right along. And actually in 2025, we only have data to October, but the home builders have indicated that if that data plays out, we're actually going to be down 26% in terms of building permits from 2024. And that is definitely not something that we necessarily expected, and certainly not the right direction to be going if we are going to be talking about closing our housing shortage. All right, so we've talked about the downward trend of housing permits, but what exactly is the number of units that we're short? And it's everyone's favorite answer. It depends. It depends on how you're measuring it. It depends on where you're measuring it. And I have to say that full credit to the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development. Usually we had to quantify our housing shortage through other proxy measures, whether it was Freddie Mac, whether it was the National Association of Realtors. They would quantify some national housing shortage, and we would kind of have to extrapolate what Maryland's portion of that was. And it's hard because a lot of the housing data occurs at the census level, at those metropolitan statistical areas. And Maryland's biggest MSA includes DC and Virginia. And there are portions of Maryland that are not really covered in any metro area. So it has been very, very hard to come up with a number that everyone can agree on for what we are short right now. But Maryland DHCD has been doing a lot of work, a lot of reporting. They've been working with the Coalition on Smarter Growth and some of the academic organizations, and they have settled on somewhere around 90 to 100,000 total units that we are short based upon population, jobs, demand, and that sort of thing. Now, that is just number of people to number of units. We know that the units that you're producing are not necessarily going to be affordable for the people who need to live in them. And so that's where we come to this 128,000 figure. That is a number that has come up through an do this report for each state. This number has been as high as 150,000. This year, it's actually come down a little bit to 128,000. But either way, you can see that once we start adding in factors like job, wages and things like that, the numbers can change kind of dramatically. Now, the other thing that has happened is, okay, that's today, but our population is going to grow as it does over time. So what do we need to do to meet the needs in future years? And a very recent report from Maryland DHCD, they had a housing needs assessment that came out in the summer of 2025. And they also recently released housing production targets for each county and even some selected municipalities. That came out in January of this year. And they are estimating that Maryland needs to build 184,000 plus units in the next 5 years. And that overall, we need almost 600,000 units by 2045 if we're going to meet our housing demand. Now, those are big numbers. It sounds daunting, and that's because it is. This is a chart from DHCD that shows here's our current housing production, which you saw in the census data, and you're seeing here. We are under 20,000 housing units per year. If we're going to meet those targets, we have to more than double our housing production by 2030. That's a lot. That's going to be really, really hard. And that should be a very sobering number for us. How are we going to build that much more housing under the same system that we have right now, where we're only building half of that? And a lot of this is building the case and sort of building the pressure to say the things that we have been doing are not going to get us what we need. The things that we have been doing are not working. We need to change it. We need to look at new options. That whole definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing and expecting different results. I think that's where we're all at when it comes to housing, those of us who work in this housing space. So numbers, all right, great. Those are the abstract numbers, but now we have to get into the human element of this. What is the housing shortage doing for Maryland residents? What are they feeling? And we have at Maryland REALTORS, we do an annual housing poll. So we poll registered voters, try to get a sense of what are you guys thinking about housing? What are your pain points? What do you want us to know about your experience? And so we started that in 2020. We just completed our 2026 poll last month in January. And you can see the trend there also is not going in the right direction, right? Permits are down. People are feeling the pinch more. And this is, 33 points in 6 years of people who say it is just too expensive to buy a home. And in 2023, we kind of added that intensity, like, okay, it's too high. How high do you think it is? And we are now, 50% say it's much too high, or 58% say it's much too high, which was the total amount who said it was too high in 2020. So, people are really, really feeling the squeeze of housing. Last year, we asked a question: what's your top issue? What's the thing that's weighing on you most? For the very first time last year, housing topped everything. Crime, education, traffic, all of those things. It was housing. This year, housing remains a very top issue, along with now cost of living, as we've seen inflation, as we've seen those impacts. So people's budgets are very much being squeezed by this. We have a similar result for rents. People actually say the cost to rent is also too high, but it slightly trails housing. I think rents were somewhere in the upper 80s in terms of percent saying that it's too high. Still kind of bad news for us. And then we've broken it down. All right, what groups are feeling this the most, or what type of housing do we think we're lacking the most? You'll see in the middle, housing for people with low incomes, housing for seniors, housing for those with disabilities. Those have been consistent over the years. And I think a lot of people, when they think about housing shortages, of course, yes, those are going to be the most difficult types of houses to find, to construct, because a lot of them require subsidies or special loan treatments, things of that nature. But where we have really seen movement is in the top, housing for younger people and those just getting started in their careers. That has gone up a lot. And that was always a big source of pain for young people. Of course, young people say there's not enough, housing for me. But we've seen a lot of movement amongst seniors who are saying there's not enough housing for younger people. That's a really kind of interesting. They were the last holdouts in that category. And maybe it's because they now are seeing what their kids and their grandkids are going through and trying to find housing. And they're remembering, wait, that wasn't my experience when I first became a homeowner. It wasn't that big of a deal. I bought a cheap house. I fixed it up. I moved to my next house. I think maybe now they're seeing that's not how it works anymore. So maybe that firsthand knowledge of someone they know going through it is sort of making that a reality for them. So we've seen the jump there. The other one where we've seen the jump is at the bottom, housing for people with moderate incomes. This was less than 50% when we started the poll. Now, of course, there's enough, moderately priced homes, the average family can afford the average home. We're seeing a disconnect in that right now. And in talking to our pollster, it's really interesting because everyone in a poll thinks they're middle class. Maybe you've heard that, right? Of course I'm middle class. You can be lower middle class, you can be middle class, you can be upper middle class, but everyone thinks they're middle class. There's someone who's way richer than me, and there's someone who's struggling more than I am. I'm in the middle. So this bar right here, that's a reflection of people saying there's not enough housing for people like me. And that's a profound shift too. That used to not be the case. It has been going steadily up. And we had one evaluation where we actually broke this out by county. In some counties, this was actually in like the 70 to 80% range of people saying there's not enough housing for people like me. We're going to break this down even more. So this graph is one that was taken of renters under 50. So we broke our poll results out by renters under 50. And here is what they are saying about if they are thinking about moving. 49% said, I would consider leaving the state of Maryland because of housing costs. I would think about moving elsewhere, another 26%. So only a quarter of people said, you know what, yep, I'm a renter under 50, but I think I'm good. I might not have to change anything. The rest of them, I might have to change something really serious, really profound about my living situation right now. And that has broader implications for our economy. That's our workforce. You know, those under 50, that's our current workforce. That's our workforce of the future. And if they aren't getting what they need from Maryland, that has broad impacts for employers being able to fill the jobs that they have, employers willing to locate to Maryland from another area. No longer are employers just looking at, yeah, that looks like a great place. They do all of these metrics. I probably don't have to tell you that. They do all of these evaluations. Our jobs pay, between, $70,000 and $80,000. Are there homes in that area within commuting distance reasonably that someone who's making $70,000 to $80,000, can they afford that? Or are they, or am I going to have to pull my workforce from someone who lives 2 hours away or lives across the state line? Maryland having a lot of across the state line in its geography. And if I have to pull my workforce from Pennsylvania or West Virginia or Virginia, am I better off just locating there because that's where my talent pool is going to be? So right now, Maryland is losing about 40,000 residents-ish to states with lower housing costs, lower costs of living. So that's your Virginias, your North Carolinas, losing it to lower cost states. And the residents that we're gaining are coming from higher cost states. So New York, New Jersey, some DC. But all in all, we are seeing, a slight out migration. And this is a sector of our state economy right now being one that is defined by structural budget deficits, by some kind of poor fiscal outlooks coming in the next few years. This sector of our economy is not growing. And that could be one that is helping to bridge that budget deficit if we were to allow it to go forward. It also has big economic impacts when it comes to the things that Maryland is investing in. We have made a big push to be one of the top, if not the top education states in the country. We have the blueprint. So we are going to take these students right now, we are going to make them the best educated, the most highly qualified in the country. What happens next? If they can't live here, then we have trained all of them, we have invested in them, and we are exporting them to other states to use their talents there to make those states better instead of making Maryland better. Not ideal. Clearly, not ideal. Something that we really do need to work on. So that has been recognized. We think in the General Assembly, and as I mentioned, within the administration. So starting in 2024, Governor Moore and DHCD put in a package of 3 bills. The one we're talking about here is the Housing Expansion Act. And that bill really got into, in terms of building, what they called qualified projects. So qualified projects being those that are on government-owned land, that are near transit, and that are lands that were owned by nonprofits. And essentially what the bill said was, if you build there and you include a portion that is dedicated for affordable housing for a term of 40 years, we're going to give you a density bonus. So you give us some dedicated affordable units, we'll give you more market rate units. And that was great. This was a good first start. But the really, we think, secretly good part of this bill was that for the first time in state law, we recognized that modular and manufactured homes are homes. They should be treated like any other single family home. So there shouldn't be restrictions on putting a modular or a manufactured home anywhere that you would put any other single family type home. The other important part of this bill was, again, for the first time, we codified what middle housing is. Middle housing being townhomes, certainly, but more importantly, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage home developments. If nothing else, that just getting that into state law was a win, because having both middle homes and manufactured homes, just the definition sitting there, that's something that you can build upon for the future. And that's kind of how we looked at this bill. Following year, 2025, Maryland passed a statewide accessory dwelling unit law, which said that for those single-family residential lots, a local government cannot prohibit the construction of an ADU if that's something that the property owner wants. They also can't put up excessive barriers to producing those units, things that they do like, yep, you can have an ADU, but I need 3 parking spaces, or I need you to run a separate water and sewer line for that property. Things that make it so that, yes, ADUs exist in the law, but no reasonable homeowner is going to be able to manipulate their lot and cross all of these things off to actually produce a unit, so that these ADUs don't exist solely on paper. Now, I would love to say that this was an enthusiastic, supported issue in the General Assembly. It was not. This bill took multiple years to get through the General Assembly. It took a state-level task force to study this issue and to come out with a report before the bill passed. That was a real source of frustration for us, because ADUs are not new. These have existed in states across the country for decades. AARP has a model ADU ordinance that could be easily adopted, but hey, we're Maryland. We have to we have to make sure that things are right for Maryland. So they finally did. We finally got this passed in state law. And the next step, which is actually occurring in counties across the state right now, is by October 1, 2026. So, a couple months from now, each county has to actually incorporate the provisions of this bill into their local zoning ordinance. I know that Howard County has already put theirs in place. We have a couple of counties that already had ADU ordinances that just might need to be tweaked a little bit, but there are some counties that absolutely banned ADUs, and they're having to come up with these ordinances from scratch. So that's really something to watch as October 1 approaches, how these localities are choosing to implement, if they're coming up with something completely off the wall when it comes to new requirements. So it's entirely possible that we may have to come back and maybe say, locals, we didn't really anticipate you doing that, and that's a no-no. So let's go ahead and fix that at the state level. Now, 2025 wasn't all good news. The Governor Moore and DHCD put in another bill last year called the Housing for Jobs Act, which would have set housing production targets based upon your employment and your job openings. The General Assembly amended that bill in the House, further amended it in the Senate. It was just going to be a study. And finally, at the end of the day, everyone said, never mind, we're not going to do that. So maybe the administration was a little salty about the defeat of that bill. So Governor Moore said, okay, if we won't do it by legislation, I'll do it by executive order. And that was in the fall, the Housing Starts Here executive order that said, we are going to come up with housing production goals at the local level so that we can measure progress, so that counties can't say, sure, we need housing, just build it somewhere else. No, you need to be responsible for your housing shortage in your area of the state. And it also said, yeah, you know what? We need to look at our permitting processes too, our review times. We need to streamline this. We need to not throw up barriers to people who want to build houses and keep them from doing it in a timely and efficient and cost-effective manner. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in January, DHCD, following up on that executive order, did put out the first round of housing targets. So in that 184,000 units that we need by 2030, you can go into this report and see, okay, here is where Frederick County needs to be. Here is where St. Mary's County needs to be. And are they producing currently the number of units to meet that target? Data, great, wonderful. You know, you can't track what you can't measure, and that's really what that report does. Okay, so that brings us to that's where we are. That's what we've done on housing. But the sobering reality being that we need to do more. And there is quite a lot that is currently under consideration by the General Assembly in 2026. So first, we have two bills that are again by the administration. First is the Starter and Silver Homes Act, and this gets into minimum lot sizes, how you subdivide land, making it easier to construct townhomes, and really trying to target the housing that we are building more to those categories of the young professionals who are saying that they have a need, the seniors who are looking to downsize, are maybe stuck in a home right now that is too large, that doesn't meet their needs, but they don't have anywhere else to go, so they're hanging on to it. That is House Bill 239, Senate Bill 36. The committee hearings have taken place in each of those bodies, and within the next 2 weeks, the General Assembly will be deciding what to do, not just with these, but with the other bills that I'm mentioning here. There is also the Transit and Housing Act. That is transit-oriented development. That is saying that within a certain radius of regular rail service, so certain MARC lines, certainly Metro, that we can allow mixed use, that we don't have the same types of density limits that we have elsewhere in the county. Again, parking minimums and things of that nature. And then finally, we have the Bring Back Main Street Act that just had its Senate hearing the last week here of February. And that is about co-locating residences in commercial areas. So that could aid adaptive reuse, that could aid revitalization, or you could put, the little apartment over the market that used to exist so that residences can support the businesses that exist there. We cut down on traffic because people don't have to get in a car to run every errand. So those are sort of the things zoning wise that the state is looking at to encourage new housing development. There is also a bill specifically on middle housing. As I mentioned, a way to build upon that definition of middle housing that was put into the code back in 2024. So this would say in areas where infrastructure is planned, your designated growth areas, your priority funding areas, that localities would need to allow duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, those types of houses that we used to have that we don't anymore. And looking through the census data, it was quite interesting. Back in the 60s and 70s, middle housing used to be somewhere in the 4, 5, 7% range of all properties that were constructed. Looking at 2024, which is the last full year of data, 0.36% of the houses that were constructed were 2 to 4 unit homes. 60 units out of a total of 16,000 building permits. We have to do better than that. We have to introduce more of that diversity back into our housing stock. Everyone thinks about the good old days. Well, the good old days had middle housing, and we don't really in a meaningful way any longer. And then finally, something that we hope should have bipartisan support is that permitting piece. How do we make sure that we don't have regulations, both at the state and the local levels, that are working at cross purposes? How do we make sure that we are using zoning tools and review tools in a way that encourages housing, as opposed to weaponizing them in ways to kill housing because you have some loud voices saying, nope, I hate it. I don't want it anywhere near me. But this should be something that we hope both parties can get behind. Regulations can be necessary, safety, environmental, certainly, but it doesn't have to be any more painful or expensive than it needs to be. And right now in Maryland, we've heard it called the Smith Island cake experience. We've heard it called the everything bagel experience. Maybe we're just really hungry. I don't know. But that is how people have described a regulatory environment, that it is much harder to build here than in other states because of all of the layers of things that people have to navigate and thread that needle to find a type of housing development that can meet local and state and federal needs and still pencil out into something that they can sell in the marketplace and that people can afford. So all of that's great, but we are still facing some political pressure, some political opposition to all of this. Local control, if you tune into these debates, you're going to hear local control a lot. Cities and counties do not want to give up their current authority on zoning. Understandable, that's how it's been done for a long time. But again, if it's not working, what are our options? We might need to, we need to make some adjustments there, not take away local control, but some guardrails around it. Again, NIMBYs, everyone knows that they're going to show up in everything. Change is hard, change is scary. People are wondering the impact that it's going to have on their home, their neighborhood, but there has to be a counterpoint to that as well. We're also seeing that some people are looking at tax policy as an alternative to actually building housing units. Tax policy can play a role, but we actually need the square footage and the roofs to go over people's head because you can't live in a tax break. And then finally, we have made progress. There are going to be those who want to undo it, and we can't let that happen. The numbers and the stories tell us that even what we've already done isn't enough. We have to keep marching forward, not relitigating the things of the past. So that's what we are working on in Annapolis. Easy peasy, right? But I do want to thank you for having me here today to talk about housing. We encourage all of you to weigh in on housing, to ask your elected officials at whatever level, what are you doing on this issue? It is of critical importance. Even if you're not looking for a home right now, it is impacting your community. It is impacting your state and local budget, which ultimately comes back to you in the taxes that you're asked to pay, or in finding workers for the companies that you run. So we need to be holding everyone accountable for doing their part in the world of housing. So I will stop there, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have.
That's great. Lisa, thank you so much. This has been extremely informative and very enlightening. I've got more questions than time, so I'm going to get through as many as I can. And I guess if you want to, yep, perfect. So I didn't get a chance to go to the International Builders Show last week down in Orlando, but word on the street is that the average home buyer says that the average home, the definition of affordability is $158,000.
Do you know the last time you saw a home?
That was probably the average sales price in Baltimore before either between the crash and COVID was that was probably the average sales price. But
Absolutely.
it's very interesting to see where the buyer perspective is on affordability and where the industry is. What would you say is the definition, if you could give a dollar amount of affordability?
Well, I think it would certainly be higher than that. Maryland is, even with affordability challenges, Maryland is a relatively wealthy
Hmm.
state. Our median home price is somewhere in the $430,000 range, which is higher than the national average. And really what we've been talking about in terms of middle housing and townhomes, townhomes are on average about 30% less than a single family home. So if we're trying to use that metric and using Maryland's wages and salaries, somewhere in the low 300s is probably doable for a lot of dual income, professional employees. But then you're also always going to have, as we mentioned, those low income units that can't be produced in the marketplace. They're going to have either federal tax credits, they're going to have some sort of tax abatement or some sort of assistance in order to reach those minimum wage, the people who keep our communities running, but that, don't have the income to match it.
Right, right. So when it comes to, I heard adaptive reuse, and I saw that for more maybe commercial areas,
Mhm.
commercial districts. How does retrofit play into this, especially in cities like Baltimore City that has, depending on who you ask, anywhere from 12 to 15,000 vacant and abandoned homes. And for new construction, for urban infill specifically, I think a great solution for industrialized construction is the 25, thousand vacant lots in Baltimore City, and I'm sure there's other jurisdictions
Mhm.
across the country where urban infill is an opportunity. How does that play into the numbers, and what are we seeing out of Baltimore City in that regard?
Yeah, well, so Baltimore City, there has been a vacants program and actually a strategic demolition
Hmm.
program there because yes, you have vacant units, but really rehabbing them, they're in such bad shape that it might be really hard to bring them back. So there is an investment from the state, probably a record investment from the state of saying, yeah, it might actually be better rather than letting these units sit vacant with no hope of rehabbing them. Let's tear them down. And there is some evidence statewide, or I'm sorry, nationwide, that could cut down on the problems that come with those habitually vacant units. The state has also put into, because as I understand it, in Baltimore, you also have some tax situations that are going on with those units. And so in some instances, you have taxes that are owed on the units that are more than they're worth.
Right.
So you really need, a big kind of redevelopment. You're probably not going to get the individual investor to keep that individual unit.
Hmm.
You need someone who can come in and buy the entire block,
Full block, right.
whether it's for
Hmm.
redevelopment
Hmm.
or to rehab multiple. You need people with capital,
Hmm.
let's say, to do that. But yes, there is, it's even some of the Main Street Act that I mentioned is actually working toward that. And adaptive reuse of commercial is is seeing a lot of improvements in areas just across the river from Maryland. Alexandria and Arlington, Virginia have done a whole lot of taking those commercial buildings that people kind of, abandoned when it came to working from home and downsizing and that type of thing. And they're having a lot of success turning those old commercial structures into now housing. So
Interesting.
it is certainly an area that we need to be looking at. We just need to look at structurally, okay, how can we make that happen? How can we get those residential uses to be allowed in things that are currently zoned commercial?
Very good point. So our thesis for the last 3 years of climate tech has always been, unfortunately, that, the construction industry is the least digitized, declining in productivity, and has a strong resistance to change. And that hasn't changed for a very long time. So I guess my question is, does Maryland have like uh, an accelerator or incubator that's set up to address these issues? To provide technical assistance, to, provide, de-risks incentives for builders and developers. I know that, NYSERDA has something similar for, their local climate laws in New York. And, Maryland has the Maryland Clean Building Hub for buildings that are subject to the Maryland Climate Solutions Now Act, 35,000 square feet or more. You
Right.
can go get technical assistance, find out where the incentives are, learn from case studies, does Maryland have such a thing for residential construction?
I don't believe, I think we're in maybe the budding stages of that. For the first time, yeah, I would say within the last, kind of 18 months or so, we've started to get into discussions of, design plans and kind of pre-approved
Yes.
design plans that builders can take and know that, okay, if as long as my lot is X, Y, and Z, I know that I could build this.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think there are a lot of discussions as to whether that's going to occur on the state level, or again, we love our locals to have a say in all of this. So
Hmm.
it has entered the mix. We also now have for the very first time, they were just hired, haven't even had a chance to meet with him yet, but Maryland has a housing ombudsman,
Okay.
brand new position that they just created. And there is some movement of, okay, yes, this person needs to sort of take ownership of looking at our permitting, but that
Hmm.
could be an opportunity in the future as well
Hmm.
to sort of have that role be the one of, okay, let's take that broad picture of how do we get into the best practices, how do we get into those pre-approved plans, and move forward. So yeah, we're probably not on the leading edge of this, and I hate that that's kind of our theme, but that's where we're at.
Well, therein lies the opportunity, right? I'm
Yes.
I'm I'm watching your presentation. It's like, wow, I hear opportunity. It's opportunity or chaos, whichever one you decide you're right. But I choose to hear opportunity there. And I guess it's an opportunity um, for innovation, for disruption. And I know people don't like to say somebody's going to come in and disrupt
Right.
the construction industry, but
Yes.
there's gotta be, another jurisdiction that's overcome similar challenges, either in the United States or maybe in Sweden. I don't know, but there's got to be a model of how to overcome these things. And I guess my question to you is, because I know you not only work in Annapolis and with policy, but I'm sure you travel the country learning
Mhm.
from other jurisdictions about how they're overcoming these. Um, who's the model that we should be following, either nationally or internationally?
Oh gosh, I mean, every state has done this a little differently.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I think, I mean, California's done a lot with ADUs.
Hmm.
Montana, I mean, it's called the Montana Miracle. They did a lot with zoning reform.
Hmm.
Utah does some really cool stuff.
Hmm.
Uh, so I think all of the models are out there,
Hmm.
and
Like the
and some
technology
folks.
exists, the knowledge base exists, right?
It is, and quite frankly, they've done these things. They've done these things previous to us. I mean,
Hmm.
they've done these things years before we did. So then you can actually see some data of
Right,
how it's playing out.
right.
And honestly, the Mercatus Center at George Mason University has a playbook that they have developed. They're like, here are all of the best practices that states have done, and it's about 18 or so things.
Hmm.
The biggest thing to overcome is our notion that Maryland is unique. And Maryland is unique. We know this. We love Maryland. We think Maryland is special, but we are not so unique that we are completely different than the experience in all of these other states. We're not so unique that we can't learn from them and model ourselves after them.
Mhm.
Yes, housing's complicated. Yeah, it's complicated in those states too,
Mhm.
right? Yes, there are interest rates concerns, there are tariffs, there are, all of these things, but they apply in those states too. Those states are making progress on their housing shortages. We need to also. So let's take those best practices. Let's try to implement them here. Not saying that we have to keep every single one,
Sure.
but yeah, we probably need to adopt some of them if
Well,
we're going to get there.
that's the framework around Maryland Climate Tech 2026. We are having extremely fascinating conversations with subject matter experts and thought leaders from across the globe who are working on very similar issues and challenges. So it's kind of a knowledge hub where policymakers and builders, developers can come and learn. Okay, what is Clark Ivory doing in Utah, right? In Salt Lake, right? What is he doing from a builder developer perspective to help overcome these challenges? How are other organizations using and leveraging industrialized construction
Yeah.
as a solution to some of these challenges as well? So it's a very interesting time, and it's exciting to hear that the ADU legislation is coming into place and will, I guess, start taking effect in October. So we'll have to have you back to give us an update so we can keep a pulse on what's happening. But how can people either locally here in Maryland or nationally or internationally support some of the legislation that you put on the table?
Sure. So the Maryland General Assembly, as I said, is meeting right now. They obviously allow people to submit direct testimony, but just contacting your state delegate and state senator and just saying, look, I'm hearing a whole lot about housing and I really need you to know what I think. It's those kind of personal stories that help. But we also run an advocacy site called Open Doors Maryland, and it's the Open Doors for stronger neighborhoods in Maryland. And
Can't see it on
hey,
the
there we
screen.
go. There
I
we
can't
go.
see it too much on the green screen. I have my
Like we're
Realtor
prepared. I
magazine right
like
here.
that. But yeah, there we kind of talk about housing issues. And you have a direct link through there where you can also be matched up with your elected official to tell your story. And I think just anything that we can do to say, the public perception of housing is not just that NIMBY standpoint. It's
Mhm.
not just the people who want to protect their corner of the universe and maintain the status quo. It's also those who are looking to the future, who are seeing this train coming down the tracks and saying, whoa, we had better do something to change our trajectory before we get to that point where we have a shrinking economy, where we have a declining population, and we kind of get into that downward spiral that we can't get back out of. Looking forward, planning for the future, that's where our focus needs to be.
What would you say is probably the number one biggest barrier that needs to be overcome when we're talking about this subject of housing affordability here in Maryland?
Right now, and maybe this is because I'm biased and I live it every day,
Mhm.
it's that friction that exists between state level action and local level control
Mhm.
of what gets built when and where. That is just the friction point that I see. Every bill that is in the General Assembly, you have, kind of your builders and your housing production folks and your low income housing advocates on one side, and on the opposite side are local governments, pro or con for each bill. And, there is just sort of this protective nature that is around local governments and their authority. That's the biggest issue that I see right now.
Got it. And if we're talking about low-hanging fruit, something that's kind of a no-brainer, kind of straight down the middle of the aisle, what's some low-hanging fruit? Maybe one thing that's just like we definitely need to resolve this. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I think the regulatory reform piece, I think
Yeah.
that is the easiest thing, um, not just practically, but also politically
Hmm. Hmm.
to get through. So there's that, and then It is harder, but there are some things that we can do to promote. You mentioned, modular and manufactured housing. That's there. We've heard that there are issues with third-party inspections. That is probably something that we need to spend a little more time on, to really open that up. It's there on paper.
Yeah.
Is it happening in practice? And I've heard from some others that that third-party inspection process is a pain point that is really stopping us from unleashing that type of housing construction.
That's so unfortunate because our neighbor to the north, Pennsylvania, has, totally figured this out. I've traveled to visit modular factories in Pittsburgh and visit, whole communities
Yeah.
of factory built homes that when you look at them, you would never know that they were factory. But I'm not talking about mobile homes. That's not what
Right.
we're talking about. These are, three-story,
Hmm.
$500,000, $400,000, very nice, factory built homes. And the whole point is for you not to know that they were built in a factory, but whole communities. So I think there's a lot to learn there,
Yeah.
and a huge opportunity for us to make some headway. So I think this was great. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that people should know about your work and what the Maryland Realtors is doing to make life easier for everybody?
Sure. I would just say there are a lot of folks who would say, well, yeah, you're realtors. You want more houses to sell, right?
Right.
And again, that's fair. Yes, of course, right? We want our members to do well. But our advocacy goes beyond just the for sale homes. We
Hmm.
have, accessory dwelling units. Those
Hmm.
are
Hmm.
not sold separately from the home that they sit on. We have done a lot of work in the rental space as well, just because we realize that housing is an ecosystem. And if one portion of it breaks down, it impacts everything else. And I think we're seeing that a little bit right now. People have those low interest rates, they have that lock-in effect that's harming housing that is available for others. So you have a lot of people who are kind of stuck where they are, and not moving. And we really need to unleash that again and to give people more choices, so that Maryland as a whole meets their needs.
Absolutely. And let's not get it twisted, folks. I mean, people in the upper tier between 700,000 and $1 million homes are having an affordability issue as well. So, it definitely runs the spectrum for sure. So, Lisa, your contact information will magically appear on the screen so people can reach out and lend their support if needed. But this has been awesome. I really appreciate your time and your subject matter expertise and the work that you're doing.
I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
All right, you too.
All right, bye-bye.